Welcome everyone to the session number 7, which is about strengthening science diplomacy via transboundary institutions. My name is Tim Flink. I'm a work package leader on conceptual approaches with the S4D4C project. I'm based at Humboldt University in Berlin and at the German Center for Higher Education and Science Studies. And I'm very pleased to welcome my distinguished guests for this session after the Nobel Prize laureate session with Peter Ager. I'd like to introduce Anindita Batra, who is a professor in behavioral biology at the Department of Biological Sciences in Kolkata. She's working with dogs, as I've understood it, and she's doing interesting behavioral research on dogs. Meanwhile, and this is fascinating, she's a very active engager and endorser of science diplomacy, and especially as a co-chair with the Global Young Academy, which is a very nice bridge, actually, Anindita, because the Global Young Academy is supported by the German academies, the Leopoldina currently as secretariat, and before the Berlin Brandenburg Academy. So here we have a connection to Berlin, basically. So thanks for being our guest. I'm very looking forward to your insights. The second guest is Edward Reading from the University of Bergen. Edward, you're not only discipline-wise a personal hero to me because you're doing social anthropology, which is one part of science and technology studies, lies at the heart to do ethnographic research with scientists and in laboratories. You do it on different turfs and different fields, but meanwhile, you have been very active with the SDG Bergen. So you're providing a platform that tries, as I understood, to engage university science into scientific advice mechanisms, especially with United Nations and other organizations. And you've been in close connection to the S4D4C project and our sister project inside as well. You've been involved in many activities that we could associate with science diplomacy, and I'm also very keen and curious to hear about this experience. And finally, we have Franklin Carrero Martinez, a trained neuroscientist from the University of Illinois, who is probably the most professional science diplomat if we are talking about formal institutions, because Franklin, you are changing institutions from the United States State Department, where you served as the State Office for Science and Technology Advisor STAS. You've been in the national academies in and out, and you are somehow an enfant terrible of science diplomacy. Now we are back at the National Academy of Science. You've probably experienced the conversion process from the Obama administration to the Trump administration, now back to a democratic government with Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. So I'm also very, very curious and keen to hear about your experience. The topic of this session is again about transboundary institutions, and when we look only at the terms, so institutions as we associate with them collectively, stabilized expectations and organizations, and transboundary, we will probably in the field of science diplomacy think about two kinds of boundaries. So one boundary that seems to be always there and has to be overcome are national borders and governmental interests, national interests, so to speak. The other boundary is basically a communication boundary between what we associate as academic research, science, including the social sciences and the humanities, of course, and non-scientific or non-academic interests from society, or if we put it more pointedly, politics as the custodian of society. As I said, your institutions somehow, but differently, if we compare them, maybe differently, let's say, try to overcome these boundaries. And my first question goes to all three of you. Tell us a little bit of your experience, and we're going to start with you, Anindita, of how your work tries to overcome these boundaries and when it was successful in overcoming these kinds of boundaries I was referring to. So Anindita, unmute yourself and tell us a little bit, and then we pass over to Edward and to Franklin.
Thanks, Tim. So I will talk about the Global Young Academy experience. I've been a member of the GYA for the last 4.5 years, and this is an organization, as the name suggests, it's global. And we are a body of young researchers from across the world, and we are all here through a selection process doing voluntary work. And one of the things that the GYA aims to do is we think that, it's our kind of motivation to bring out the voices of young researchers at different platforms, especially where policy is going to be decided, where people are going to take decisions for the future, and where typically you would require to have a lot of gray hairs and a lot of years behind you to make your presence felt. So the GYA strives to bring out the opinions of young people, because often we are the ones who would be at the receiving end of a policy which is being decided today, but we don't have a say in the policy when it's being prepared. And this is what the GYA has been working towards for the last 10 years. And in the recent years, we have been able to engage with a lot of partners, for example, the Inter-Academies Partnership or the International Science Council. And we've been conducting these worldwide meetings of national young academies, in which we can bring together a lot of young researchers from across the globe through their national academies and go through brainstorming sessions, put forth a lot of ideas, a lot of opinions, work towards the SDGs, because one of the very, very important goals of the GYA is to feed back into the SDGs. So we have working groups working on climate change, biodiversity, global health, AI, education. So these are many aspects in which the GYA membership are engaged in. And science diplomacy is one aspect in which we take active interest. We also have a working group on science diplomacy, focused in the South Asian region, where we are trying to bring together countries which are politically not very engaged with each other, sometimes at loggerheads with each other, but we are trying to get young researchers from these countries come together, discuss scientific problems, discuss social issues into which science can give feedback and help towards building a better future for these countries in terms of, say, pollution control, in terms of disease research, in terms of education research, in terms of pedagogy. So these are different aspects in which the GYA works. And in many cases, I think we've been successful, especially in terms of talking about open access, talking about right now we are working on a project where we are trying to work towards a common framework for quality assessment of research, where again, young researchers are again at the receiving end, where somebody has decided the policy of how research should be assessed and we have to go by it. But then what do we think about research assessment? What do we think about evaluation, promotion practices? We are putting together a lot of data to work towards that. So these are some of the basic areas in which the GYA is working. And I think it has been a very fulfilling experience for all of us. I will wait for the other panelists and come back with more inputs based on your questions.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. Also, one aspect that I wasn't really aware of that seems to be relevant to the Global Young Academy is that it also has something to say about, how the quality of the science system itself can be enhanced, and what perspective young scientists play in it. We come back to that later. So thank you very much for this input. Edward, as already said, you're having quite a long-standing experience, wrote books that dealt with international, intercultural affairs from the anthropological side. How do you transfer this into your more policy-oriented work that I somehow summarized and outlined? With SDG Bergen as an initiative, and the University of Bergen, who's been astonishingly active regarding, United Nations interfaces. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, thank you, Tim. Well, the University of Bergen is one of those mid-sized European universities that is kind of broad-based. We have all the schools. We have 6, 7 faculties, med school, law school, and all that universities usually have. Nothing special about that. But the university also has a strategy that emphasizes a threefold axis of climate science, marine or ocean science, and at large global challenges, which then translates quite neatly to the 2030 agenda and the SDGs. And SDG Bergen is a formation that has a strategic capacity under the university leadership, which is tasked basically with developing channels for the communication of any type of science research from our university into external channels. Or into external arenas, basically. We started out really by testing the ground on a few dimensions that were obviously relevant to the university's research strengths. Actually, at the United Nations Ocean Conference in 2017 in New York, where we had a specific agenda concerning SDG 14. Which fitted well with my own personal career as a Pacific Studies scholar. The SDG 14, life underwater, was in a sense the Pacific Ocean's own SDG. We worked out a number of connections into the UN system simply by testing it out as we went along. Building on that, there is also another dimension of Norway that I should point out, which is the sometimes small distance between, say, the university sector and the government sector. First, universities in Norway are owned by the government. Our owner is the Ministry of Education and Higher Education and Research. But second, government ministries like the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, for example, seek continuous advice from Norwegian universities. So from that perspective, we started developing SDG Bergen as a channel for connections between the university's diverse repertoires of research and science into the broader field that is multilaterally defined by the United Nations, but also by the 2030 agenda and the SDGs. So kind of a fortunate marriage, in a sense, of interests was created in that our government found it convenient to work with our university to organize Norway's official side events. And I think we all know what a side event is. At UN gatherings of all kinds, there are side events which can be at their best sort of instant happenings of connections between science and diplomacy. We organized then the University of Bergen, in collaboration with our Ministry of Foreign Affairs, organized Norway's official side event at the COP24 in Poland. We organized Norwegian's official side event at the High-Level Political Forum in 2019 in New York, that forum which discusses the SDGs at large. And we have continued in a way doing these partnerships. But we have also done the transboundary dimension perspective that is under discussion here. We have tried to, in a sense, work even in an even broader way. one boundary that we are concerned with and we wish to address is the boundary between established science and local forms of knowledge. That was also up for discussion the other day. I saw your Dutch colleague, can't remember his name, Evert, I think,
yeah, Evert August, yeah.
who took this up. And of course, at all our side events, whether in Poland, in New York or wherever, we have interacted with ambassadors and representatives of Pacific Island countries. Mm-hmm. This comes from my own network, which I find is an easy connection to make. So we have found the dialogues to be extremely fertile, bringing in scientists and diplomats, both from Norway and from small island developing states, not just the Pacific, but also the Caribbean, where we have been discussing these interfaces between diverse forms of knowledge as they can inform the implementation of the 2030 agenda, which they necessarily have to do. Yeah. So from that perspective, I think our transboundary perspective here at our little or mid-sized university is one of working multilaterally with a multilateral system, particularly the United Nations, representing Norway, if that is relevant, which comes from the compact nature of universities and government in Norway. But also expanding the transboundary issues to fields of diverse forms of knowledge. And I will just finish by saying a punchline now from our side event at the HLPF in New York in 2019. A young speaker on behalf of the small island developing states of the world said a punchline in the opening plenary at the HLPF, namely, science is non-negotiable, which was quite a strong statement to make in those days. But she should also say that she was from the US-dominated part of Micronesia. She was a very brave young woman and says science is not negotiable. At our side event, we brought that element further into the discussion and came to another kind of a double punchline. We quoted her by saying science is not negotiable, but it can be ignored.
Yeah, oh, that's a very good hook, Edward. Thank you very much. And I pass that over to Franklin. Thanks for being our guest, Franklin, from the National Academy of Science. So over the last couple of days, we had this phrase in different kinds of shades of gray being discussed. And I can remember that I think it was David Meyer from the Joint Research Center of the European Commission said, in times of scientific denialism and, authoritarian states, populist governments, I wonder if cranking up the volume of science would actually help. But what is rather needed is, how to get to politicians and provide them with evidence and somehow suggest that scientific solutions can be drawn to. But Franklin, you have been in the State Department, so the governmental branches that also deal with science diplomacy over the last years, but then it's also been the National Academy of Science and other surrounding institutions. Just let me ask you the following question straight away. I always had the impression that over the last years, we came from conservative to democratic governments in the United States. So we're talking about George W. Bush, then the turnover to the Obama administration. At that point, the AAAS stroke a coup with the founding of the Center for Science Diplomacy. The National Academy of Science had their stakes in, and then the wheel was pulled back with the Trump administration, and all of those supporters for science diplomacy, endorsers, left, or some of them left the state governmental branches and went back to those institutions such as NIS or NASAM. So probably most prominent figure was Vaughan Tarikian, being drawn into these institutions and going back to, non-governmental outsider institutions. So how has the United States been over the last years? Can you tell us about this transboundary between formal governmental responsibilities in terms of science and especially international science policy and those surrounding institutions a bit, because that would be really enlightening to the debate on science diplomacy.
Thank you, Tim. So for me, and as you said, also I've been at the National Science Foundation, which is another, I was at the international office. I want to make a quick distinction. So in the State Department, it was a policy making institution. At NSF, through funding, it's a policy implementing institution. And now at the academies, it's a non-governmental organization. So let me start a little bit with the academies. It's an organization, non-government. A lot of people confuse it and think that the academies are part of the government. We're not. We were founded by Abraham Lincoln over 150 years ago with the purpose of providing independent, objective advice to the nation on issues of science, engineering, and medicine. As you say, part of the reason why I think the US ecosystem related to science, science diplomacy, science policy is robust and can withstand some, let me call it hiccups to be diplomatic, in our political system. It's precisely the fact that we have multiple non-governmental organizations that have as part of their mandate to carry on this work. Under good times, it provides a sounding board, it provides independent objective advice, it acts as a source of additional knowledge, expertise. Not every government knows everything, and it's impossible, having been in government, to have deep expertise, especially in areas that are emerging. So that's why you see in my case, I came from academia to government. I've been in and out of government, and it's quite normal in Washington to see that. That's, you enrich your career, you enrich your connection, and you enrich an understanding of how the government bureaucracy works. And in some cases, you even develop an appreciation of why bureaucracies are there and the real purpose of maybe that kind of friction in place. So in terms of the boundaries, I would say they're fluid depending on who you're dealing with. In some cases, at the academies, and you mentioned in part of your previous discussion, making politicians and policymakers understand the science. I would say that that's one dimension, but another dimension is different sectors in society. Sometimes we tend to overlook and underestimate parts of the society that may not necessarily have a scientific degree, but there's people that are out there that are highly educated. And some that are not. That's another dimension of society and the different boundaries. Sometimes at the academies, we're making a greater effort to reach out those that are non-scientific experts in order for them to have access to the information. So we have projects right now that instead of talking to doctors, researchers in COVID or other areas, we are doing a greater effort to make our message accessible to others. You'll see that happens in different shapes and forms, whether it's simplified language with access to in connection to the primary material. In some other cases, it's some diagrams and other things that are easier to share online and reaching other audiences. So it really depends. When you talk about society, I think Edward just touched upon indigenous knowledge, marginalized communities, younger populations, there's an older population, there's minorities and underrepresented. So right there, when you see society, there are multiple boundaries that as institutions and individuals within those institutions, we have a responsibility to bring to the table. We have that responsibility to bring those other voices. As Anindita was saying, we cannot forget the youth. In the context of sustainability, in the context of the climate crisis, we're leaving the planet in a mess for the next generation. So it is important that they are engaged in finding those solutions. So right there, you see an interesting interplay where I would say sometimes those boundaries are a little bit fluid, and institutions have to have that flexibility to understand that. When institutions are too rigid in defining hard boundaries, sometimes they may be, their advice, their contributions may be outdated or maybe not necessarily useful and relevant to all parts of society.
Thank you very much, Franklin. Just a quick word to the audience. If you want to raise questions, use the Q&A section. I haven't seen some yet, but do take the time and write down some questions. We might have then a few minutes left to address these questions to the three speakers. Anindita, you've been an expert on research with dogs. So if I raise, the image of Pavlov's bell, basically, and transfer it to the Global Young Academy, who's reacting to your bells most immediately in politics when the Global Young Academy is entering the scene and offering advice? And which dogs do not respond at all? Tell us a bit.
That's an interesting question. We do receive a very good response from bodies like, for example, the World Science Forum. Last World Science Forum, the GYA did an exclusive session in the World Science Forum meeting. We were invited to organize our own session. We have been invited by the World Economic Forum. So right now we are in conversation with the UN for a couple of projects. So when we are looking at international organizations, which are really key players in cross-border policy making, then we are receiving a lot of positive responses. As I said earlier, we have very active partnerships now with the International Science Council and the Inter-Academies Partnership, which have traditionally been organizations which help senior academies to network, but we are getting a lot of positive responses from them. We have received a good response from the people associated with the EU in certain projects, especially with discussions of Plan S, open access. Right now with, we're doing, as I said, with scientific assessment. So I cannot say that we have really directly interacted with politicians as such, or governments as at an individual level. But when it comes to trans-governmental bodies or big international networks, then the GYA is being recognized more and more as an organization to reckon with. We are being contacted by many organizations whenever they are trying to come up with policies. For example, recently we did a joint statement on anti-discrimination with the GYA and the IAP and IC. Just yesterday, we released a communique with the IAP about how the pandemic has been responsible for affecting research and higher education, and this was a global call to action. So this was something which was developed completely in collaboration between these two big partner organizations, where the IAP kind of gave the voice for the senior researchers, and the GYA gave the voice to the worries of the young researchers. So whenever there such big projects are being taken up, I'm happy to say that the GYA is getting more and more recognition and get more and more invitations to participate in these large-scale projects and topics of discussion, brainstorming sessions. But we are yet to engage with governments directly, so that would be kind of the next step. So those are not the quote-unquote dogs which we have even attempted to ring a bell to. So I cannot say that they're not responded, but we have more contacted policymakers at the level of large organizations, and we have definitely received a very, very positive response.
Would you also say, and this might tally with what Frank has said, that the Global Young Academy, and maybe Frank, you can also add something from your point, Edward also, is a transboundary institution in the sense that it somehow trains the awareness of its members, who then, you know, move to other institutions and have a more sensitive approach to the way how scientific knowledge can inform policy making or decision making in general. Is that something that you would see a value in for your organizations?
Yes, definitely I would. In the sense that, for example, I could say for me, I have always been interested in science education and outreach, but I have never thought in terms of science diplomacy before I came to the GYA. And after I came here, the idea of science diplomacy as a very, very powerful tool, which can help both scientists and different stakeholders in society to hold. And eventually I went on to co-found the working group on science diplomacy in South Asia. So the GYA has a transforming effect on its members, and we can see a lot of members engaging in different activities which they had never even thought about before coming to the GYA. That's one thing. The second aspect, which we don't really talk of in terms of science diplomacy, but I think this is where, you know, both Frank and Edward were talking about in terms of indigenous knowledge and other kinds of diplomacy. At the GYA, an experience which I would like to share is that, you know, once you go there at a very, very cosmopolitan, cross-cultural ambience in one of the AGMs, where you have 100+ members from across the globe coming and, you know, spending 5 days together from breakfast to post dinner, brainstorming, engaging in discussions, you also become aware of cultural boundaries, practices. You know, for example, before coming to the GYA AGM, I didn't realize that for some set of people across the world, saying hello by a hug is very normal, whereas for some, even a handshake is not so normal. You know, so even some things as basic as that, or something like asking permission before you take a photo of a person. It's something that it's not normal in Indian culture. Or, you know, you shake hands with people, fine. But even cross-gender handshakes can be problematic to some people because of their culture. These are issues that we really have to take into consideration. Often we think that, you know, there's just one culture, and when you are doing diplomacy, there's this uniformity, which is not so. You know, heterogeneity at multiple levels needs to be taken into consideration when you're talking about science diplomacy. Because what is right for me, even in terms of my scientific thought, might not come across to you as right the way I place it in front of you. Because different cultures have different sensitivities and sensibilities. And this is something I think the GYA has been a transforming experience, that you become much more accepting towards these different diverse sensitivities and sensibilities, which helps in negotiations. I think I have become much better at negotiating with people across cultures. And when I say negotiating, I say it in a positive way, not, you know, negative of negotiations, but I definitely have evolved my skills at negotiation, skills at, you know, talking across the table to people from different cultural backgrounds, different scientific backgrounds, fields of research, talking to an artist, talking to a sociologist, talking to an economist, a philosopher, but talking science. That's something we have definitely learned at the GYA.
Thanks very much. That was a very clear and strong statement. Maybe in terms of timing, because we have 2 questions coming in, I would read those questions. So Andrei Polijak has asked, how influential do you believe your institution is to international decision-making based on scientific evidence? And what prevents it to be more influential, so on the downside? Edward or Franklin, would you like to take this question and respond to Andrei?
Well, I could say something about the university sector. Yesterday, my good friend Hilletje van 't Land from the International Association of Universities argued very well for the kind of the global role of universities and higher education, and by definition also research-based knowledge into the 2030 agenda. I think there are two dimensions to this. One is the barriers to communication that do exist. Another will be quite the opposite, namely the opportunities that exist. From a certain perspective, universities as such, on an individual level, each individual university are not by definition accredited into the United Nations system, for example. Yet we can work as science delegates to our government. I've done that. I've also worked as a delegate for some of the Pacific Island states in ocean governance negotiations, for example. This is mainly a question of individual connections of forms of knowledge. But the alliances of universities, the global alliances of universities, and maybe in particular the International Association of Universities, which is, as you know, a UNESCO-based outfit that also has a global outlook on membership and on the 2030 agenda, in that they have a cluster of hubs, each of which addresses one particular SDG. My university has SDG 14 for the IAU. So in a sense then, I think we need to be both localized and global. We can be influential in terms of generating new channels, but we can also be influential by exploiting and using established channels. Nothing, in my view, compares to the scientific channels established in the UNFCCC system for climate science and the annual COP meetings. Our friends in the climate sciences have unparalleled access to global decision making on the level of the UNFCCC. We can learn from them, but we can also build global models that somehow integrate diverse forms of knowledge, diverse forms of scientific practice. There is not one scientific methodology. There are many. There are many forms of knowledge. My favorite example, because and this is maybe not popular for some, but since we are in an EU context now, I think the European Green Deal, which is much talked about, could learn a lot from relating more concretely and consistently with the 2030 agenda. And in that way, I think maneuvering across individual universities and university alliances and scientific subcommittees and what we have, there is a lot of potential in developing this. But I stick to my observation that nothing still compares to the connection that climate science and its predictions and its models have to the UNFCCC, which is really something to learn from.
Thank you very much, Edward. Franklin, what is your take on influence of the institution you represent? So is there something like more of an informal sense when you've been influential in maybe co-shaping or informing decision-making also on an international level? Or is it even measured in the sense of having KPIs that you think are relevant whenever it comes to advice that the National Academy of Science is providing? How does it work?
It's hard to measure that influence, especially at the international scale, because sometimes you just don't know what goes into shaping or informing policies in another country. I'll give you a quick example. A couple of months ago, I had a conversation with a science counselor here in Washington, and he told me that he downloaded one of our reports and fed it through their foreign ministry. So if we are going to measure, for example, the downloads as a measure of potential impact, right there we have one country that downloaded one copy of our report, and it's now somehow going through their decision-making, policy-making process. So is that influence? I would say yes. But depending on the metrics that we use, only one download seems irrelevant. So it is very hard to know, and how do you measure that? That's why, for example, in the case of the academies, all of our reports are freely available. You just need to provide your email, and that's it. You can download a PDF of literally all of our reports that are published out there. Part of the reason why I believe, like this colleague mentioned, that he provided that to his ministry, it's because at the academies we have a rigorous process that is based on consensus. We disclose potential biases, we disclose potential conflicts. In some cases, we exclude individuals that may have significant biases related to the topic or conflicts. In some other cases, depending on the nature of the conflict, we take measures to mitigate those. So it's part of establishing a process that is trusted and provides that advice. Prior to joining this call, we were talking about consensus, and like sometimes consensus could be quite challenging, because literally in order to reach consensus, you're having different opinions and sometimes very lively, strong debates happening at the table. But I still believe that that's the way to make sure that a lot of different voices, different perspectives are heard. And if you have an established process, if you have an independent way of reaching that consensus, that's how you can not only strengthen the impact, but also increase the potential for influence of your advice.
Thank you very much. In regard of the time, maybe Mara, it's a nice time now to see whether our graphic designer has come up with a nice comic strip of our slightly unstructured but nevertheless very interesting discussion. Can we enlarge that on the screen now, or how does it work? I see it in a very small space. Here it is. So we are having a very nice picture here. Bring other voices. Make politics, politicians, society understand science better. Science is not negotiable. The strong statement from the young scientist. I can't read because it's too blurred on my monitor. The other one here, how to measure impact and influence is a very big question, and I'm glad, Franklin, that not everybody is into it, this numerical kind of evidence-based quantification of impact yet. So with 3 minutes to go, first of all, I'd like to thank the three of you, Anindita, Edward, and Franklin, for your vital contribution. I learned that the institutions you represent in your work is much more about lending evidence to governmental organizations or other non-governmental organizations. It is about sensitizing people, about educating those who are members of your institutions that then become future science diplomats, if we overstretch this term, as being biased in our conference, but I think we all know what this means. So somehow we are raising awareness among people that are in these institutions, that the things they are doing, even though they are sometimes only scientific, matter to society and should have a greater voice, whilst not neglecting tacit local knowledge, indigenous knowledge, and cultural angles that are brought into, as Anindita, you were referring to with your experience of the Global Young Academy. I'd like to thank you all. Thanks to the audience, we've had almost 100 participants watching our interesting session. The next one is actually taking up this issue because Susanna Kepler-Schlesinger from the Vienna School of International Relations is talking with my colleagues about training young science diplomats or future science diplomats So that might be a very good hook to the next session. I wish you all the best to the United States, Franklin, to India, Anandita, and to almost our neighboring country, Norway, Edwards. I hope you stay healthy, get a vaccine as soon as possible, and I hope to see you in person one day or another. Thanks a lot. All the best to you. Goodbye.
Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.